So good afternoon, everybody. We are here to talk about financing the new economy. And we have a great panel that may not be diverse gender-wise, unfortunately, but it is very much diverse in terms of experience, expertise, and background. A few words about each of them. Piyush is the CEO of DBS, Southeast Asia's largest bank. He's known for his considerable expertise and efforts in bringing technological innovation to banking. He spent 27 years at Citi, and he practices what he preaches in terms of digitalization. Next to him is Charles Lee, not from Citi, but from JP Morgan, where he spent a considerable amount of time. A lot of you know him as the CEO of HKEX, but he has become the de facto spokesperson for Hong Kong's financial center. And his involvement is both into the traditional financing tools and non-traditional financial tools. And finally, on my left is not Citibank, not JP Morgan, but Goldman. Gary, who was president and COO of Goldman, had an incredible career there, and then went to the public sector and spent a year as the director of the National Economic Council, and known in particular for the work he did on tax reform and deregulation. 2 minutes on context. Everywhere you look, things are changing. You feel it particularly in Asia. Countries are becoming more prosperous, they're climbing up the development curve. New regional institutions have emerged, and as you heard from the video, are having a huge impact. The region is on the investment radar of many more Western companies, not just as a source of capital, but also in terms of a destination for capital. And led by China, Asia is at the forefront of a lot of innovations going on. Look at Singapore in terms of what it does for fintech every year. So there's a sense that if you want to talk about the new economy, if you want to talk about new financial tools and how that is changing, you come to Asia. But you cannot be a good house in a challenged neighborhood. And the neighborhood is challenged. Trade policy is in flex. There's lots of questions about governance, politics. There is significant market volatility. And financing conditions are tightening. So what we're going to try to figure out is where does all this come out? And in particular, if you think of a range, where do we end up on this range? At one end is the new economy gains traction, new financing tools allow more people to participate in productive activities. We end up living in a multipolar world and doing so on an orderly basis. The other end of the range is fragmentation, conflict, financial volatility, and all the problems that come with that. So let me start with you, Piyush. I think of Singapore as being one of the most agile economies in the world. It has always embraced the notion that it's small, open, and therefore it has to be very sensitive to what's going on around it. And it's seeing now a lot more uncertainties for small open economies than it has before. How does that affect your thinking in terms of how you position the bank and the choices that you have to make in that process?
Well, I think I like to think of Singapore's basic strategy for the first 50 years of its existence as an inbound strategy. So the focus was on building the hard and soft infrastructure to allow multinationals to come into the country, and that in turn generated growth, export-led model, multinationals coming in. I think one of the big changes is that this inbound strategy doesn't work anymore. And so as the world is changing, Singapore is rapidly getting into an outbound strategy. I sometimes think of it as a GNP as opposed to a GDP strategy. And you think of an outbound strategy, then you have to think about your role in the broader region and figure how you can play a role connecting the dots in the region. In that context, this idea of becoming the world's first smart nation, of really becoming digitally enabled, is a huge driver. If you can make that happen, then you can create role models and you can further your connectivity into the region. In some ways, that's very similar to what we're trying to do with the bank, to see how we can leverage our position over here to be an integrator of capital and trade flows around the region, and how we can use digital transformation to be a pace setter, reimagining how the nature of banking itself will take place going forward in the future.
Now, one cannot talk about the region without spending a minute on China and how China is redefining relationships every single day. This is not about an emerging power versus an established power, because when it comes to finance, China sort of still respects the predominance of the dollar, but is building a lot of pipes around it. Bilateral payments agreement that basically bypass the dollar. The AAIB, the Chinese development institutions, the One Belt, One Road. From your perspective, are these initiatives gaining a lot of momentum? And is there enough commitment to them to see them through in a world that is becoming less hospitable to this sort of regionalization?
Yeah, I think whatever you're seeing that exhibit from China that is going out, like the few examples just mentioned, that is so tiny in the context of what the domestic market is really about. Think of the domestic market of China as essentially the world's last and largest captive capital. And that market is essentially so large, the second largest in the market, globally, but it's actually closed from everybody else largely for a long time. So, the big issue for all of us sitting outside China's, financial borders is to peek into it and see exactly how that, because unless you understand the internal capabilities, internal challenges of that market, you will never be able to really fully understand and analyze what is being, seen as, a certain small efforts to go beyond that border. So in many ways, Hong Kong is trying to see whether we can help the world uniquely find a way to get access and help China uniquely to something out. So if you think about it, it's almost like China's market is Yangtze River, Three Gorges, Yellow River, and everything else is all freshwater. The rest of the market is all ocean saltwater. And the freshwater and saltwater today don't really mix, okay? And you can't really have a whole bunch of sharks to flow up there, and it's just not going to, even including Goldman Sachs as big shark. When you swim up, Yangtze River, maybe 5 miles up there, you're going to be dead. It's over, right? And similarly, a lot of the Chinese fish really can't really come downstream to the ocean to survive either, because they are just fundamentally different today. But there is an urgent need for the world and China to converge in that. So our idea is to find a way to see whether or not we can connect it through Hong Kong. We are like in this big delta area where the freshwater meet the saltwater, and we are chemically capable to do both, and we will help people to essentially interact, interchange, and hopefully that mixed water will becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, eventually Three Gorges coming down the ocean, and over time it will mix. But I think right now is how to find a way for that mix to happen so that chemically China can change and the world can be benefited from that massive capital, and China can be transformed through the introduction of the international.
So before we go to the big shock, so people will say, but hold on, wait a minute. You both offer opportunity and risk. You offer the opportunities you mentioned, but you also offer the risk of ending up opening the Chinese system too quickly. and a lot of the legacies of the last few years in terms of potential financial stability would play out. So how do you see that balance between the opportunity and the risk?
In fact, China is afraid of the external risk imposed into China much more so than whatever.
How about you? How do you view the internal risk, the risk of internal financial?
Well, that internal financial risk, even inside that fresh water, they're just different kind of mixes. They're different kind of priorities. They are evolving needs, the risk and the people, because that market is only 30 years young. Our market, being 100 years in New York and London, and that market, the exchanges, the regulators, the fund management industry, the private investor, everybody were born on the same day almost back in 1992, 93. So essentially, you have a market that is so flat that you don't really have a layered market that is the generation, sentimentation of nature. This is really a self-created market, artificially created market out of nothing. And that market is learning from everybody. That market, in terms of its rules and laws, is almost copied from the SEC rules. But the practice, the actual implementation, have to reflect the fundamentally changing and rapidly struggling internal forces for them to find that internal logic, so that logic become a more sustainable, more predictable, and then that logic can start to be connected with our external logic. So Hong Kong is being that translator. We're trying to get the round pipes connected with the square pipes, trying to get a 110 voltage to a 210 voltage, trying to translate and convert her, trying to find a way to make everybody so the shark can swim a little bit further away.
So Gary, I must tell you, for reasons that I don't quite understand, I watched the Meg on the plane, which is about this big shark. But people, when they refer to a big shark these days, no longer refer to Goldman or the US. They refer to this notion that Asia can be self-sufficient in finance, that Asia need no longer worry about external capital, that there's so much capital in the region, if we just mobilize it properly and allocate it properly, okay, Asia can finance itself. And slowly, Asia need not worry about the rest of the world. How do you feel about that view?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. When you look at the capital markets in the world today, and you look at what goes on around the world, the dollar is still the reserve currency of the world. We talk in dollar terms. When we had the introductory slide to this segment, we talked about the Asia market in terms of dollars, in terms of billions or trillions of dollars in balance sheet. I think for Asia to continue to grow, one of the big factors, as you've said, I don't know which analogy to go with. We'll go with, I guess, fresh water and salt water. Why not? We'll go to brackish water. For the water to mix, you need to open up the capital markets. Asia needs to open up its capital markets. It needs to create open access for foreign investors, foreign direct investors. Needs to develop a yield curve, a really transparent yield curve. And you need to have a currency that everyone understands and freely floats in the world. And I think that is a key part, or one of the key ingredients that is missing. Yes, Asia can do a lot for itself, and China has done a lot for itself, and the government has thrown an enormous amount of capital into the system. But overall, that's the government's capital. And at some point, it just doesn't create the breadth and depth that you need to create to be a global powerhouse.
So Piyush, a lot of people would listen to Gary and say, oh, that's the old view, okay? And that's the old view that means that we should continue outsourcing our savings to the US. And if only we insourced our savings, we wouldn't have to listen to any of this stuff at all, and we wouldn't have to inherit the instability that comes with opening up your system, with having a freely floating exchange rate. Where are you on this view?
Well, I have to say I'm in Gary's camp. The reality is that Asia's investment needs are massive. And whether you talk about infrastructure or urbanization or entrepreneurial capacity needs and so on, I mean, ADB's famous number of $1.7 trillion a year is just infrastructure investment. And you sort of multiply that with this, you're talking about several trillions of dollars. You saw the slides when we walked in. The two China development banks are doing $200 billion. If you add in the entire lending capacity of all the policy banks in China and the commitments over the next 5 years, you get to $800 billion. So the first number starts with a T. The second number starts with a B. There's a massive gap. The reality is that the total savings pools in Asia are nowhere near adequate to fulfill the investment needs of Asia. Now, having said that, it's not to say there's no money in Asia. Obviously, there's $5–6 trillion of reserves in 6 countries. That's a lot of reserves. Savings rate in some of the countries like Korea, China, Japan are high. So there is a better job we can do intermediating our old capital. It's quite instructive. The IIF data showed about $1.2 trillion flows into Asia from the West. About 800 or 900 flows out of Asia from Asia to the West. So there's a net inflow of about 300. Now, clearly, Asia can do a better job of intermediating its own capital instead of round-tripping it from the West. But I still think that the biggest sources of capital are in the West, in the US in particular. And you will still have to figure a way to crowd in that capital into the region, along with better intermediating local domestic capital as well.
And you think both can coexist?
I think not only both can coexist, the reforms that are needed and what is required to make capital come in is about similar for getting, Goldman Sachs or BlackRock or Blackstone to put in money. Those are exactly the same things that Temasek or GIC or anybody else in the region needs to see before they put in money. It's not that much different.
Okay, so Charles, let me ask you that if we speak in terms of economics and finance, of course both can coexist. If you bring in politics, it's not so clear that both can coexist. So let's talk a little bit about the political angle. There's a view in the region that the trade war is not about trade at all. It's about containment. You hear that word containment. To what extent, A, do you think that the containment aspect could spread beyond trade? And B, what happens if other countries, small countries, have to make a choice? That they say you have either the US path or the China path. There's already talk about 2 internets, right? Okay, how does the region evolve on that? So first, okay, can containment, quote unquote, spread to finance? And secondly, will the smaller countries ever be faced with that choice that no one wants to make?
Yeah, I think in the end, and Dr. Kissinger was, very clearly, seems to be holding the view that we're going to resolve this. We're going to have some real tough times. This is like China. I wrote a little blog about this is a marriage, right? And China, happily married, 30 years, everything works great. America made a lot of money out of it. China sacrificed 2 generations, but eventually built a great restaurant that can sell everything to the world. And then the Americans start to, this marriage is going through the 7-year itch, and it started to really have a real problem because number one, it says a dumping in my neighborhood. Number one, number two, you're taking stuff from my house and thinking, because the Chinese in-laws sometimes take a few things, and you're thinking you don't really need it. You really don't need it. What's the big deal? And then sometimes you would also, and then they also said you keep on making everybody eat Chinese food, but you never allow your people to eat Western food. So what's the big deal? So, but in the end, the last thing is about this containment. It's about that fundamentally we're different, and that you're going to build this restaurant, and one day you're going to stop serving us if we don't agree with you. So all of this is really the marriage seems to be coming to an end. Now you're in the kitchen, you're throwing stuff at each other, and you're getting mad. So one thing I think the most important is in this moment, you start to really ask yourself, are we really ready for divorce? Can we actually divorce? Can we actually divide the house? Can we actually divide the commingled finances that we have? Do we actually force all the neighbors to take sides if this happens? And also, if we keep on doing this, yelling at each other, and one day, some sort of physical alteration happens, we could lead ourselves into something that Dr. Kissinger talked about, is that it's never intended. So now it's time to go back to your room and just chill out, and I don't think we're going to be back in love again, but I think we can still live in the same house and carry it on.
So two things. A, you didn't notice A, you didn't notice that Gary started leaning towards me when you said the in-laws take stuff from the house. Okay. B is the reason why divorce lawyers make so much money is because people don't go and chill out at all.
No, I think
Okay.
what happened is that the marriage, American took early gains the marriage into America. China essentially sacrificed our labor, our protection, our environment, and everything else, but we did get something. We built a restaurant, beautiful supply chain, we talked about it. Now we're ready to open business to supply everybody. And now American says, we don't trust you anymore because once you have this restaurant, one day if we don't get on good terms, you're going to deny us. So therefore, we're going to build our own. So we're not going to use yours anymore. So the Chinese are having a very big bafflement today saying, well, you take the money, you didn't distribute properly inside your own country, why are you blaming us for it? But then the Americans go back to see the 4 things we just talked about. And I think each have a lot of beef. And but so what? You know, all marriages have beefs. And,
So Gary, A, do you agree with the way Charles characterized the winners and losers from the marriage? And B...
No marriage advice here.
And B, you know, how far does the divorce go?
So I look at this in different analytic terms. This is, in many respects, a phenomenon that's going on in other places in the world right now. You know, as I'm sitting here listening, I'm thinking Brexit, where it looks like to me the path of least resistance this week, not that we're here to talk about Brexit, is let's pay the divorce payment and still live together.
Yeah. Which
is what Europe looks like it's going to be to me, which seems kind of silly, but never been divorced, so maybe I don't understand how it works. In the world we're in today, we're going through a natural evolution from what I can see in this world. And we talked about this earlier. You know, we had a world where every country had to be self-contained and they had to do everything from themselves because the logistical situations made it that we all had to provide for ourselves. Because of the evolution we've lived through in technology, in a lot of different businesses, we've now been able to globalize the world and make the world a much smaller place. In doing that, we have become completely interdependent on each other. In many ways we know, and in many ways we don't know. And I think we've woken up to the fact that we are interdependent on each other, and we don't love it as much as we thought. And we now find ourselves in places where how could we no longer be self-sufficient for some basic skills and basic needs that we have? And there's this feeling out process while countries go through, should we be at risk to not be able to be self-sufficient in all of our needs? And I think that's going on right now. And we got driven there through a technological revolution or evolution, which included, you know, the internet, which included the ability to move data around the world at the speed of light, which included transportation and being able to move product from a factory floor in China to a retail store anywhere in the world in 24, 48 hours. And that's where we are now, and that's just a reality of life. I don't think we can go backwards. So I don't look at it like we've got a choice whether we live with each other or don't live with each other. We're where we are. We're going to continue to move forward. We're going to have growing pains. There may be areas where we have redundancy because of national security. We feel like we have to create some redundancy, but I think we're trying to figure out where those sort of goalposts are right now, where the comfort level is. What can I be completely dependent on outsourcing, and what do I really need to have internally just in case?
Okay, actually, let me, Robert, I think there's another thing that most people forget, and that is that we're looking backwards, and in some ways, all the angst, trade wars, trade surpluses, imbalances, we're fighting battles of the last 30 years. The reality is that Asia is changing. Asia is changing from the factory of the world to increasingly the market of the world. It will be the marketplace of the world and already is. So 10 years from now, the issue will not be, hey, Asia is supplying so much and creating trade surpluses. The issue will be, how do we maximize and capitalize on the demand, consumption, and growth of the billions of people in Asia? So the issue will be market access. But the challenges will be very different. And the minute you switch that, your analogy, you know, at the age of 50, you work all your life and provide for your wife. When you turn 50, maybe your wife starts working and provides for you. So you have a migration. But I do think in the future, the fundamental ballast that has held the US-China relation, which is the commercial ballast, that will continue to exist, except it will be Chinese, Asian, and East Asian demand for goods from around the world. I think that's going to be a really powerful
So we can go down that avenue, but we're not going to, because we have 9 minutes left. I want to go down a different avenue, which is the younger generation listening to you, all of us, would say, they're talking about divorce, they're talking about how they're going to split things up, they're going to talk about changes. That is why we need to basically take governments out of the equation. That is why we need cryptocurrencies. That's why we need peer-to-peer lending. That's why we need blockchains, okay? And that is the future. And the more we can develop that, the more we can maintain a vibrant, dynamic, financial set of interactions that isolates us from these sorts of squabbles and everything else. So I'm going to look at all three of you, because all three of you are involved in different aspects of that. How realistic is that view, and what is the real role of fintech in Asia going forward? So we'll go down this way.
Well, let me first, it is the big question of cryptos and, you know, whether cryptocurrencies can replace, you know, the savings pools and payment systems and currency as we know it. And frankly, I don't think that's going to happen in a hurry. It's like the tail wagging the dog. I think till such time as you have nation states, you have national agendas, and you have national identities, I don't think any government will let crypto or any third currency hijack monetary policy or hijack state national policy. I think the minute it gets too big, they'll step in and put barriers on this thing. So the assumption that people or nation states will abdicate control over the economy is a national...
Okay, but that's the easy answer. I wanted the more difficult answer, is what role will it play?
Right. So my thing is, I think cryptocurrency will play a limited role inside closed walls, blockchain. So you know, in a casino, the chip matters. Outside the casino, the chip doesn't matter. So I think you'll find closed walls in which you'll be able to find alternative mediums of exchange, call them cryptocurrency. I think the bigger power of fintech in the short term is really financial inclusion. Around the world and in Asia, there are hundreds of millions of people whose savings pools have never been tapped because they're outside of the formal system. And that's beginning to change. When India launched the Jan Dhan program, 300 million accounts opened in 18 months, unfunded, but today there's $7 billion in those accounts. And with direct benefit transfers, that's a savings pool which was never tapped into. So I think fintech will change that. You will start finding larger pools of savings coming to the formal net, coming to the formal system, and that will be a driver. I think you will take inefficiencies out of the system. So that will grease the wheels of finance more efficiently. I think that will be a driver. Improvement in whether it's investment returns or payments. I think all of that will help. But if you ask me, will cryptocurrency replace fiat currency anytime soon? Probably not.
Charles?
Well, I think cryptocurrency, I don't think in any country or a region where you have a central strong government, I don't think it has any real future in terms of being a currency. Africa, probably the only continent. If God leave anything for Africa to be great again, number one, maybe they use cryptocurrency simply because there's no way out. But blockchain, again, for anything in the financial services industry that requires, you already have trust and causes issue, I think is going to be on the incremental. I want to quickly focus on something else that we are seriously looking, is China could redefine the world global financial market. Essentially, we treat equity, fixed income, and commodity, highly refined data. But China today is the country that is completely digitalized. Every single behavior of every single consumer is digitalized in a massive pool of data that is essentially controlled by about a dozen companies. And that will allow China to be the first country, and we wanted to be the first exchange, to essentially find a different proxy of underlying of trading for financial market that is much closer to real economy, but it's a more standardized of the current data that is completely connected everybody else. China completely superseded, jump over the telephone age, fixed telephone age, and then we'll jump over credit card, we'll jump over the current fixed income and currency and equity, and probably will be the first place where financial market, Wall Street, quant funds will be trading data or information that is much closer to real data, much far closer to a real economy. So that's something hopefully in 5 years, if this forum still happens, hopefully by that time I will be still the CEO of the first exchange of data as an asset class.
So I agree with both of my colleagues up here. Crypto's not where we're headed. Blockchain's where we're headed. And the idea of blockchain technology and the idea of having computing power in your personal devices and being able to provide banking services to the world, literally in your palm, it's not going to be in some new currency. It's going to be in a currency that we know, but we're literally going to open up banking services to the world, which is going to change savings rates, going to change spending rates, going to change consumption patterns dramatically. Many of the old line analog businesses that may be relatively new, 10, 20 years old, are going to change again. We are going to go through a second technological revolution, and blockchain is going to be the backbone of it.
Okay, I'm going to end with something that I didn't alert you that I would do. It's something that I hate being asked as a panelist. So you'll not.
Okay, you can start with Gary in that case.
No. I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to go down the list.
Hey, I'm the fill-in. I'm the fill-in.
You're Mark Tucker.
So we're going to play a relative value game, okay? What would you go long and what would you go short in the following thing? RMB versus dollar over the next 12 months.
Dollar.
Looking at you, Shanghai or the Dow?
Shanghai or what?
Shanghai index or the S&P 500?
I don't care as long as everybody's trading.
No. You got to help us here, because
Shanghai Dow.
Okay. Alibaba or Amazon?
Oh, that's a good one. Alibaba.
Okay. With that, thank you all very much, and thank you for your attention.
All right. Thank you.